All right.
Okay, so I'd like to introduce Dr. Joanne Jakovich, and I think I met Joanne for the first time last year through through this meeting. Yeah. So I came along to review a design panel, which was a really great experience. So Joanne is an innovator, designer, researcher and exhibiting artist specialising in crowdshare innovation and its application to urban planning, governance and business innovation. So really Joanne covers a whole wide range of design. She is a senior lecturer at the Schools of Design and Architecture at UTS and is a core member of the Centre for Contemporary Design Practice. She's a co-founder of the UTS u.lab, and I think a number of us have experienced u.lab along with Joaquin as well, and producer of a new generation of urban innovation projects such as Groundbreaker, Bike Tank and City Switch that embed design-led innovation and entrepreneurship into the city. Her creative work has been exhibited in Japan, Australia, Taiwan and the Netherlands, both in architectural and artistic contexts, including the Kwandu Museum of Fine Arts Taipei and the Powerhouse Museum Sydney. And she's the editor of 4 books, first author of International Academic Journal and conference publications, and presents regularly to public and professional audiences.
Wow, that was
long.
Wow.
Welcome, Joanne. Thanks, Adrian.
Joanne. Siobhan came into a subject I run called advocacy, and is that loud enough for us to hold it down there? Good. And told us about all of the work at Stockland, and I thought, there is a fabulous woman, I have to grab hold of her. And it took me a while to get her attention because she was incredibly busy. So thanks very much for the chance to talk tonight. I'm from the u.lab at UTS, and so is Joachim Schweitzer. He's here in the blue shirt, there he is. And I'm presenting on behalf of both of us. The u.lab is an interdisciplinary lab. We are really a grassroots or sometimes guerrilla unit across the university. We run across 4 faculties, which is unheard of at the moment in UTS and across lots of universities. And we're looking at innovation, essentially, and a lot of organisational and cultural innovation, so how you can change the way people innovate by changing the structures within which they innovate. That's essentially our kind of the gist. So what I'm particularly going to talk about tonight, here's the button, is something we call crowd-share innovation. It's our research topic at the moment. So essentially I'm interested in collaboration, rather than individual creativity, a kind of a collective creativity. And I think you'd agree with me that as human beings we don't just evolve, we're transcendent, or we transcend. So we're constantly looking to improve things, to better things, to go beyond. And this is something that we unfortunately can't change. It might make us inherently all designers as well. So design. We, rather than talking about design per se tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about our experiences and let you discover what we think about design from that. I don't really have a position on it, I don't think. I put my hand up for no, but that's because I'm going to talk about crowds. And so we met with David Kelly when we were in Silicon Valley. We went to his office at IDEO, and you can't really see there, but we're sitting in this fabulous round pod that he designed so that you can have really good conversations, kind of an audio acoustic little hub thing right in the foyer of the office space. He told us we learn 2 really important things, that if you read enough and watch enough of what he does, you learn them well. One is, of course, human-centered design, understand the user, and what he really specifically does is understand, rather than understanding 100 users, he understands 2 or 3 really deeply, which I find quite interesting, and that's where he finds those insights. The second thing he said to us, if you want to start a lab like the D School, which is the, I don't know if you know it, the interdisciplinary lab at Stanford, you need about $10 million. And so we left. It really did say that. Jochen will agree. So I'm going to draw, because I didn't really have time to work out how to do this any other way. And I'm a very analogue person, really. So design. I'm going to talk about design on here. We kind of have since about the 1960s been looking at processes and methods of design, and essentially for me what design theory is always talking about is the facilitation of emergence, which maybe I've got on the slide, there we go. And a lot of sort of theory has sort of said, well, you've got your problem, you're looking for a solution. One way we can find a solution better is to say, well, let's expand all the places we're going to look for solutions. And hopefully, when we sort of begin to discover more things, we get this sort of sense of emergence. You kind of get an aha moment or something like that. So a lot of design theory sort of sits in this little bracket here where it says we can diversify the pool, essentially, of ways we are looking at what this area might be. And some of those in which we see it at places like the design school, the design thinking schools are so wider research, wider framing, looking at the whole, not the parts, exploring empathy, user-centered design, this kind of thing, so exploring the ways in which you're looking at that thing, ideating, prototyping. Prototyping enable you to, again, to sort of experience emergence and expanding that experience. And of course, collaborating with wider groups of people, so that if software comes together with audiology, you get different products, new mindsets, and different skill sets. So essentially a kind of collaboration fits in here for me, as well as prototyping, as well as the kind of things that individual designers do. So it's about expanding that diversity. And more recently, maybe not so recently, people like our collaborator at UTS, Kay Storrs, was saying, well, we need to think more about the problem. We're so solution focused. We need to sort of understand things like framing of problems. Strategic design looks at systemic problems, the causes of things. And so then we sort of get this area that's sort of focusing around here. So rather than P, we've probably got Q for question, or S for sort of understanding systemics. And I think, well, I just leaped 2 minutes. Yeah, I suppose what I'm going to sort of look at the moment is until now, a lot of collaborative theories of design have sort of said, well, let's expand the types of people we interact with. Let's interact with the users, so stakeholder engagement, so let's understand the users through empathy. So our interest is in actually, well, let's just go way beyond that and look at the crowd. What can lots of people tell us, even if they're not the users of this particular problem? For me, there's a lot of understanding about collaborating in design, but not a lot around this sort of idea of the crowd. You will agree with me that many of these sort of ideas, the aha moment and the sorts of things that we ascribe to creativity, come from our very sort of strong background of understanding of individual creativity. So it's this sort of sense of the genius that was formed post sort of Middle Ages. It was a Renaissance thing, this idea that an individual wouldn't, in pre-Renaissance people were artisans and craftspeople, and they collaborated, and they didn't really have this sort of personality that arose in the Renaissance. And so there's this sort of division that occurred with creativity, and that either you were an individual creative, and the lesser form was a collective creative. And what we're really, really interested in at the moment is expanding again, and with the impact of social media, understanding that collective creative, like who are they, how do we facilitate that, how do we go beyond stakeholder engagement and user empathy, and what on earth are those tools, and how can it be done? Breath. What have I got there? It's expanding the solution space. Aha, yes. So the question I'm going to sort of throw tonight is to look at what happens when this diagram goes a bit left and a bit more to the right. So typically we're kind of a cognitive bias towards solution focus. More recently we're saying, yes, these sorts of things are important, so strategic design is starting to look here. I suppose what I'm trying to ask tonight is, how can we, it's quite new, so it's how can we build situations in which the kind of activity that happens here isn't constructed, but it's a much more common part of life? So I would begin to say, how can we prevent problems on this side of the diagram? And one thing that I put on this side of the diagram is that design doesn't really focus a lot on, which the users have to focus with is how do we understand implementation, usership, measurement, all the things that designers really do, but they don't do as much as they do in this space regarding adoption of new technologies and things like that. So strategic, so essentially in this zone, this is where we're working, crowd share innovation. We're trying to understand how can we build situations where there are more divergence, where there is more divergence, more boundary crossing, and more empathy. Empathy, I find it's a real sort of interesting word that everyone's using a lot. I've heard it already tonight. And I suppose the first time I experienced trying to think and understand someone else was when I travelled to Japan, 19 years old, went for a year, and went to Tokyo instead of London, which is what most people are doing, and really found the difference really confronting. Why do they do those things socially? Why are they so much the same? How are they so consumerist? All these different things. And Andrew and I were talking to our friend who is the priest who married us, Catholic priest, and he was telling us about how when he travelled to Japan, he was just so frustrated, he couldn't understand the difference. And so it occurred to me that understanding empathy isn't something you can cognitively learn. He's a priest, he should be empathetic. He should be a humanitarian sort of person, and he really struggled with it. And so one of the things I really strongly believe in exploring is how do you teach empathy, how do you train it, so to say, and what are all of those things that are involved with that. What time have I got? About 2 more minutes?
Yeah.
All right. Someone's got to wave when I go on for too long. So with the u.lab, there's a program of things that I've been running and that we've started running in the u.lab, and there are different kinds of interactive workshops that run for different periods of time. Some of them have started off longer, and we've started doing a lot more shorter ones as the time's moved on. So what we're really trying to do is this, break that problem. One of our people in the CrowdShare program we ran actually wrote that. That was fabulous. So we think education is a really good place to start. At the moment, the education system that we work in is highly competitive. Students come out of that high school mode and they're in university and they're still competitive. They don't learn collaboration. The CitySwitch program that we're running is taking students on international exchanges for very short, intensive design thinking weeks. They're working with that variety of different disciplines across 2 countries. And this is a group in China, really trying to understand a development issue. And some of the interesting things we found with taking students away, getting to experience design thinking in a foreign environment, is that there are skills around social sustainability that you can teach, but they need to be in context and they need to be embedded in these sorts of programs. Things like ethics, values, active citizenship, harmonious behaviour, participation, cooperation, so understanding of social and cultural diversity, well-being, responsibility, and the kind of behaviours that have to learn to do that: dialogue, empathy, compromise, negotiation, reflection, engagement, interaction, and problem-solving in diverse teams, which is one of the big focuses at a lot of the design schools. But there's all these other things. So yeah, they're interacting with locals, trying to understand their situation, working on installations in that space, and these are the kinds of issues and mindsets. So if we come back to this, how do we consider what's good design and what's bad design? For me, this is something you can kind of judge. And a lot of people at the moment are trying to learn design thinking, and in companies, and we get asked a lot of the times, how can we facilitate this? How can our company become more creative? There's a lot of debate around that, but for me, essentially a lot of that is looking at process and really simplifying things, so that design becomes about problem solving. So it kind of just, I don't know, it is at an initial spot just there. Yes, you can include empathy, but really it's a kind of a process in which there are a lot of solutions, maybe not a best solution. So good designers, how many of you are designers who would say have studied or worked like half maybe? They solve kind of more than the original problem. They're opportunity seeking, so for me they're kind of sitting right back here. They're speculative, they're creating new realities, new perspectives, new futures, and what they're trying to do all the time is make a paradigm leap. So this is enhanced by creativity, so you have a what if, a vision making sort of thinking, and that can facilitate that kind of emergence. So what happens if we add more diversity into that environment, or that we actually begin to sort of take the question of the crowd here? We, in trying to change education, or innovate education, we ran a program called the Bike Tank. And we designed a structure. And so we really think with a lot of this, it's about designing structures that people can participate in a different way, so that they're interacting with society differently. So we designed these events that run in the morning that were directly integrated with our teaching, so that a public event would run, and then straight after that our studio class. So at these events we had different people coming in, and this is where we began to sort of test the ideas of crowd share innovation. We'd have a single problem, we'd run something called a 5x5, so again designing a structure in which some kind of emergence can evolve. A 5x5 is 5 fast steps in 5 minutes, 5 minutes each, so 25 minutes of a kind of a collaborative, fast, rapid prototyping, ideating kind of process. And what we really began to discover is that people were not really focused on here, but what they were kind of really focused on is the how can we implement this. They were also thinking back here, so sort of the opportunity seeking to solve more than one problem. And the main thing that we think the sort of the crowd share innovation approach could work with is building a kind of a sense of enthusiasm and optimism to move into that space, but to actually begin to tackle problems across other spaces. So even though things weren't specifically being solved here, there's a kind of a culture building practice that was enabled through the kind of work we're doing there. So I'll just sort of wind up, and so I had a bit more, but I think I'll leave it for conversation. The kind of things that can go wrong with collaborative work are enormous. You've all been in these incredibly sort of naff environments where things just sort of don't work, there's no flow. What happens afterwards is always the big question. We did all these great ideas, where'd they go? These are the kind of problems that we're always trying to solve at the moment. And so within the work we're doing, we're beginning to work now with City of Sydney to begin to link things that are happening in collaborative, crowdsourced challenges, and to tie them into outcomes, into grants and things. I've skipped it, but we started working quite a lot with organisations. Some of you have been to our programs at Groundbreaker. And really what we are interested in there is how organisations can open up their innovation process to the crowd, to anonymous, untrained, random people. And so we went through a whole series of sort of facilitation of different kinds of public and private open innovation programs. I'll leave that there. So I suppose to conclude, I think the kind of things we're talking about to get into that area and that area, they are skills and they can be experienced. And I think the more people in the public have, and people in organisations have the chance to experience those different kinds of mindsets that we spoke about, the more that we can actually begin to construct environments where problems are being solved in a much more distributed, open, and a sort of a parallel way, where we're not getting a problem and a strategic designer to solve it, but we're sort of distributing that responsibility way further. So that's really kind of the goal and the mission with what we're doing. So that I think good to stop that.
Thank you.
I could go on forever.
I'm going to start off with a question, and that is, we started to explore this a little bit at Groundbreaker as well, particularly in relation to this idea of the crowd and I guess the knowledge and the intelligence that the crowd can actually bring to a problem. What then is the role of the designer? Do we still need a designer to provide some kind of leadership in directing the crowd? How do we get that balance right?
Yeah, we're looking at a kind of a notion of someone who's like an mix between an entrepreneur, a designer, and a community facilitator, because I think the skills are really broad, and they're not the strategic design skills. They're a little bit more broad, and they're not your traditional design skills. So I did sort of begin to sort of think there's a need for facilitating openness. So that's something that constantly actually needs to be facilitated, and understanding of diversity and things like that. There's some kind of stewardship, which is a word that I know strategic design uses, but it's when you're working with a crowd, it's very different to them working with an organisation who has a directed goal. So they have to be able to channel energy, goodwill, manage distribution of labour. We see a lot of this kind of thing work well with the open source software movement, but how do we transform it into a city movement or something like that? And then there needs to be some sort of judgment, critical thinking, shaping, reflection skill that someone needs to have in order to facilitate. Yeah.
Over to you.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly how this relates, but I remember really clearly some discussions that I had many years ago when I was at the Kunst Academy in Copenhagen. And discussion is part of this a throwback on agrarian societies where some of those problems were never big problems. They were solved in the day-to-day actions of everyone. Everyone solved their problems as they moved forwards. And I remember one of the lecturers at the Kunst Academy saying, I have no idea why we have a furniture design department in this college. They design beautiful furniture in Denmark. But he said, oh, we've got so many wonderful chairs to sit in, it's a total waste of time. We're wasting our time on all that stuff. It's already sorted.
Yeah.
We need to move on to other stuff. And is it, I mean, I'm just curious that in certain times of our civilizations, this has just been day-to-day problem solving as opposed to the
specialist problem solving. Yeah, I agree. What can I add to that? I thought that's a great comment.
So some of those problems we create for ourselves because they're probably not even problems.
That's true. And I suppose we're in a much more complex physical environment and political environment, and you know, that's the types of challenges we are having now are humanitarian, environmental, and all those sorts of things. So I suppose we do need, my view is that we do need to go back to, we need to go forward to a way in which people have a lot more skills, and probably mainly confidence is the kind of thing we're talking about. So it's experience so that you can apply something like empathy into different environments. And we're kind of looking at technology, we're looking at social media and things and thinking, well, if there's all of these things we can leverage that exist, and people follow those by their passion and by their interests, and so you've got sort of lots of natural attractors there. And how do we use them so that spread is much more productive and that people have those basic skills?
And we give up on some of the stuff we actually spend all of our time designing so that it sells a lot of money. So we put an awful amount of energy into some of the design professions, trying to design stuff which is really, to some degree, relevant.
Yeah.
Well, we haven't focused on the stuff that really needs design.
Yeah.
That's true.
I'm really interested in Groundbreaker, but I was just wondering, for the crowd, do you provide a framework for them to work in, or do they get to provide their own framework?
I think we're experimenting with lots of different ones, but I think a framework is of some sort is always necessary. On the weekend we're at Shaping Sydney, I don't know if you were there, which was an unconference. So there is a structure, but then all of the people in that conference get to design what topics they talk about. In our situation, we sometimes have topics, but then we have structures within that. We often use time, you know, different organisations of people moving in and out of spaces. Yeah, I think the solution is in structure. I love the book by Alex Galloway called Protocol, where he looks at the way control has changed, and we've moved out of a hierarchical control society into a distributed one, and it's been enabled by the structure of the internet, by the protocols, by TCP/IP and things like that. So I think that's my kind of Bible of thinking this thing through, is like, what are those structures that are going to relate much more to a contemporary internet, social media kind of society.
That's really interesting that you brought up. I wasn't able to go to Shaping Sydney, but it was, basically hosted by Arab, and everybody was, into it. And I think it's great that people are doing that kind of stuff. One kind of, I suppose it's a criticism. I think
Can you just speak up, Michelle?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Whilst I think that what it achieves is probably in the looking for expanding that universe of solutions.
Yeah.
What I always think is actually that part around, what do we do with all these great ideas? It's probably a really good generative phase of solutions. It's probably a really great. It's fraught to all sorts of issues as well. People who hijack and sabotage and all that kind of stuff. If Tim were there, you'd talk about what Tim wants to talk about. That's for sure. Just kidding.
I'm not even on yet, and I'm getting
I'm the same Tim, Dom.
No, it's the force of the personalities that are involved in all those different things. But at the same time, I can't help but think as or loosely or whatever meta-structured as it is, I feel like there's opportunity to innovate on that model in the sense that it's great letting all these people have all these kind of conversations, but that's what a party is, But what would be great is if at a party everybody was actually recording what they talked about, and then they came back a week later or a day later or whatever, and they actually brought it all together and said, these are actually things.
Yeah.
So I do think that's where the big gap with moving, if you're working with crowds and you're understanding that you can leverage a lot, the opportunity is in how you then allow them to self-organise but have these kind of structures around
exactly, and that's
bring them together at the right amount of time.
And with that model, I just feel like it just disperses. It just goes all sorts of different ways.
Yeah.
And I was thinking today about it actually.
Well, it comes back to the conversation we're having yesterday with Rachel, who referred to the idea it's not just pattern recognition; it's how do you actually get the intelligence through the crowd, which I think is a really interesting thought.
Yeah, because we're great pattern recognizers.
Yeah.
But we're not necessarily very smart.
Yeah.
How do you define a crowd? Is it geographic? Is it what's the?
Joanne, you want to answer that one? When we began to sort of promote Groundbreak and talk to companies and say, do you want to open up your innovation processes? For us, because they do a lot of customer-based innovation, service design type stuff. They talk to users and that kind of thing. But this, for us, the crowd was a little bit broader in experience, a little bit unexpected. Publicly advertised was a priority. Jochen, anything else? I don't know. You do.
I think I would maybe call it the interested crowd.
It's true.
If you pose a challenge, then you attract certain kinds of people.
Certain kind of crowd.
Self-selected.
It's an interested crowd. Especially in the Groundbreaker program that we ran, we had challenges that were publicly available, and people would just sign in to participate in the workshop, and you could assume that they have an interest in the topic.
Yeah.
We haven't really had a chance to experiment with the uninterested crowd.
Or a dispersed crowd as well. So you mentioned Twitter.
Yeah.
You've also mentioned open source development.
Yeah.
Something key to my heart.
Is it?
A lot of open source development actually happens by the guy who is or girl who's sitting in their study, very late at night, and something frustrates them, so they fix it, and that's how open source kind of gets together.
So when we sort of put together these three words, we thought about mixing kind of design thinking processes, which we've been experiencing and working with crowdsourcing, but we didn't think it was going to be crowdsourcing because that's often online. So we want to develop much more the sort of the process around face-to-face innovation in these kind of meetups and things, because they are often unstructured and they often don't lead to things.
No, I find it I think you have to use it for what it's intended for, and I think it's generative phase. If you try to use it as a decision-making process or as a something that's going to form a blueprint or anything to implement or allocate resources and time to, it's a waste of time.
But I do think that if you have more stakeholder engagement across the design phase, you do get better products and better outcomes. So part of what we're discovering is that people getting involved are self-selecting, but then they're also self-selecting to stay on to projects that they may not have been involved in.
Oh yeah, I'm saying in complementary with something else, for sure.
I know we've got a question down the back from Angus.
Angus.
How does that all tie in with that, I suppose, theory that, one of the reasons we got to where we are today is because we have specialised?
Yeah.
And we have focused intensely on one thing that we're good at, and that's what we do. And then how does that then build upon this notion that you get a crowd together, they tend to focus on how do you build a better car, how do you build a better horse?
Yeah.
Not, oh wow, let's think of electricity, because generally the crowd doesn't think of electricity, an individual does.
Yeah,
If
I
my
think
understanding of history is right.
that's a good point. I think there's a lot of ways this can't be used, and a lot of ways that it can, and the kinds of problems we're interested in are around organisational innovation and social innovation, educational innovation, things that involve people inherently. So when it comes to innovating around those sorts of things, I think it's less useful. What was I going to add? Lost you.
Can I piggyback on that question, or a lot of the discussion really? So some of the things I've heard, and I have no formal training in design, but I know something about creativity. A lot of what I've heard speaks of design as being, at least in the context of the talks tonight, as being something that becomes every day, that becomes something that you don't think about, that's facilitated, that's structured, that's kind of organisational. To me, and also what you're talking about in terms of opening up the problem space and then kind of opening up the solution space, and then that narrowing down kind of process. I'm wondering, I guess it's more of an open-ended question, but what do you see that there's a changing role for creativity in design, or because it seems like they're becoming detached?
Detached?
Yeah, creativity in design.
That's why I think that the word design doesn't need to be used. That's why we made this sort of term up, because I do think design is a very difficult discipline, and that design thinking being used in lots of different organisations, it doesn't necessarily strengthen design. So I do think that what those places and organisations are trying to do is bring more creativity into processes, and design gives you a kind of a structure, or design thinking gives you some steps in which you can try and understand things better, expand that space, all of that kind of thing. So I suppose that's what I'm going to answer yours as well, is I do think you do need to have really specialist people who are trained in design and trained in anything, but our argument would be that a lot of those things that have separated us since a kind of a Renaissance period, we're in a highly kind of individualised society. We need to be looking at different ways we can build other skills for collectivity. I suppose that's the argument in a way.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because you started off with the example of Japan and how alien it can sort of feel from a Western perspective. And it's a very structured society, but they've done a bit of this in terms of the Kaizen and the improvement circles and stakeholder engagement and in a more of a collective sort of culture. So there are examples and there are other things that perhaps we could learn from, which might teach us how to engage.
Do you know the funniest story? I take students to Japan back now that I've come to live in Australia, and I was there with Adam Jasper, who's the historian / philosopher at UTS in the architecture and design schools, and he did one of our 5-day workshops, and the Japanese are incredibly good at collectivity. They just grow up with it. All the kids do these after hours. I can't remember the name of it. There's like groups, they're clubs. Every day there's a different club. So we were down at one of the train stations rebuilding something that was going to have a guerrilla garden and all the rest. And he came up to me, he's like, "Joe, this is like some kind of weird Christian camp." And I'd been in Japan for so long. And there's this big movement called Machizukuri, which is city making, and it's across the whole country. Millions of, the hundreds of thousands of people involved with it, and it's normal. We don't have that kind of culture here, and it's just beginning to emerge. But they do have a much more collective conscience, or collectivity sort of approach.
What sort of things are they doing and working on?
They have very strong, localised movements towards improving the urban space. They're amazing. They're like our not-for-profits here, and some of our sort of start-up in the green space, but they're pervasive in Japan, yeah. There's some great books I can show you, Tina, if you're interested, yeah.
So I had a question about UTS. You come from UTS.
Yeah.
Anyway.
How about you? Do you?
No, I'm working with them at the moment, and they're undergoing a major capital works project.
Lots of them,
at the
yeah.
moment.
Yeah.
And a big part of it, as you know, is this idea of the campus in the city and interaction in the city.
Yeah.
And this seems like a perfect process to engage people. Have you tried it through the program? Have they involved you?
That's a great question. I was chatting to Victor earlier, and I said, one of the interesting things about the way universities are structured, they're not structured to enable you to innovate across the silos of your disciplines. So the faculties, if you don't know, are run like great big organisations, and they're almost autonomous, and they compete against each other for funding. And so Joachim's from the business faculty, I'm from design. When we write a paper together, for example, we're worth half as much to our faculty, because half the point will go to him and half will go to me. And so there is this inherent thing that we are working against. We are disruptive, and we've got some enemies, which is probably a good thing. I think if you don't have some enemies and you're trying to do something innovative, then there's a problem. However, yes, they have been very good. They did send us to Stanford as part of the experience of getting a group of young academics to begin to start something from the bottom up, because the politics at the top of the university, the business school versus the design school, and how do you do design thinking, how do you do innovation, they wanted this thing which has finally been called the creative intelligence strategy, which you may have heard of, which is now being implemented in a much more structured and financially sort of supported way, whereas we're still running quite a lot on like the smell of an oily rag, behind our barricades, trying not to get shot.
It might be answered by somebody else, because maybe it's just an ignorant import question. But actually what you're describing is really, really similar to just the standard charrette process.
Charrette?
Charrette process?
Oh, yeah, charrette, yeah.
Yeah, because it seems as though, and it kind of comes back, and Deb would be familiar with it obviously, but it's about that scale piece, right? When you have a small community and a community is looking to do a redesign, you've reached that tipping point that the everyday ownership and small problem solving needs to have a larger facilitation, I guess, or a stewardship, and that's when you bring somebody in for an actual crowd shared innovation. And you have the arts projects like Michelle shared months ago now, the Before I Die, I Want To sorts of projects, and you start having these sorts of innovative design thinking processes to actually give people some ownership over what they do. And I feel like kind of what you said, maybe it's just not done in Australia that often, but I guess my question is, one, is that actually part of Australian design culture and design education? Because I had that obviously coming from the States. And then two, is that kind of what you're speaking about, or is it actually something a bit broader than where you actually facilitate engagement in intense sessions with groups of people?
I think to answer the last part of the question, I think the interesting thing is to begin to say, well, if people aren't in communities already and we bring them in from all over the place, what can we achieve? Because I know a lot of work we have done in architecture schools and things is around the charrette model, where you do work with specific communities to solve a problem, blah, 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 blah. I really like this brochure that my collaborator in Japan wrote, and he called it the arts of encouraging the city. So that's just kind of jinglish for what we've been doing. And the way he describes it is that you've got to train the local councils or cities or authorities to understand community participation in a lot of the cases and to know how to leverage it. But then with what we do, we work with really ordinary, everyday people, old people, young people, school kids. It's actually giving them skills as well in order to know how to interact with the councils and to have agency and to make change. And so it's a kind of an encouraging process, and
Yeah.